Everybody, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Is that okay? Yes, my name's Wolfgang Buttress, an artist, studios in Northern England, and yeah, I'm also delighted to be back here. I was last year to be with the Mayfield, this amazing building, and yeah, it feels a real die. So new for the next couple of days, we're looking forward to meeting Loki, chatting gear, and yeah, hopefully learning a lot and having some fun. I'm an artist, and when I was younger, my past really saw about pains. In the 2D, everything's in flux, everything moves, nothing is kind of constant. And I believe, art can actually change the way we see or feel the world, or how we see about ourselves. It's kind of once you've seen a turn the sky, say if we talk, for me I'd never see like dust or sunset the same way kind of changes you can just inside your body. Very much like when you see one of these water lilies, I just saw seeing paints is amazing, water lilies, that's anyway, that's all I am, so see the world. So it has this amazing ability to change and alter your perception of the world.
And when I was younger, I suppose I was
full of existential teenage angst, things that raised was it's called punk rock, and everything was this expression, almost this kind of ecstasy, that somehow I kind of thought that everything was inside me, wasn't part of the world. And a few things changed as well as I got older. I moved from the big council estate in Birmingham to the north of England, to Cumbria. Bees, I went to Japan, and these things fundamentally kind of changed as a person and as an artist. And I kind of felt part of the world, but apart from it. Somehow I felt this needs to kind of be expressed in the practice. So there were these things which is quite interesting. When we in the West, we often talk about the light as a signifier, is a metaphor for spirit. Is in the East, it's like in Japan, so they do some. So of it's about shadows, and you find mystery, and you find the spirit actually use their shadows. And it's in some ways how we actually maybe experience the world. It is in the darkness, things that aren't seen visibly. And so I was asked about 10 to 12 years to design a UK pavilion for the Expo, for the Expo, and the theme is being finite. And I was a little bit skeptical about what these expos actually for, but council for, well, you get one simple idea, you might be able to do something quite fundamental and maybe change people's perceptions. I knew that bees were, and pollinators are dying in unprecedented numbers due to climate crisis, pesticides, monoculture. Well, they pollinate 30% of the food that we eat, and I sort of thought, if I can really express this one so simple idea through an experience, through also sculpture, it might just change the trajectory society. We're probably less likely to kill something that we love. And so to kind of do this, I found I need to kind of create team, and I think sometimes in life when you're open to these kind of moments of serendipity just kind of present themselves. And there's incredible scientist called Dr. Martin Bengshire, who does this research into bees and how bees communicate. And when I first lifted up this framed bees, like inside my hands, it was thousands and thousands of these creatures, amazing. Smell was fantastic, the smell of the honeycomb and propels. But it was the sound for me. There's a real deep connection between myself, this frame of bees, and the earth. And this drum kind of went into me, and smart past the foot. It made me feel light, it made me feel excited, and it made me feel a real kind of connection with the earth, the bees. I thought somehow if I could express this as a sculpture, I'd get a really amazing thing. So what Martin does, he puts these little things he's in the centre of the screen. Something external on this international vibrations. Bees, we believe that but they communicate through vibration, not through sound. And through the information implementation of these accelerometers, vibration sensors, and how you can sense wiki, understand what beings are doing in real time. Let them out swarm, whether they're coming back. But more importantly, what's for me is how they communicate. And Martin has just discovered this incredible language how bees communicate. They talk like dolphins or whales, you know. So as a superorganism, they're incredibly intelligent and incredibly humbling. And so this idea, so if we have this live data stream from the accelerometer, could we express this as like the sound to an audience, which should always be changing, always moving, always fluid, not static. So it becomes like a conversation between the audience and the piece of sorry. So, what you can hear, there's the sounds of bees communicating. So, Buttress and friends of mine, famed band called Spiritualized, being in the recorder studio, and we had this live stream of bees that came into the recorder studio. Deirdre plays the cello. She very quickly realised that the bees hung in the key of C, so she started playing the cello along with the key of C. And the daughter was a singer, started singing along, and so we had the sounds, and it was like an epiphany, the sound of the cello, the bees, and the human voice. And it was just an amazing thing. So sometimes you have these moments in art which are life-changing. This was wonderful. And so what we did, we created a whole library of sounds, all of the key of C. And so whatever the bees are doing in real time, they will trigger these sounds. So what you're actually hearing is the bees authoring the soundscape, the bees authoring the light. So it's always changing. It's not like going into like a static kind of white room in a gallery and observing and what you see. You're around, all the senses of the are engaged. One of the, for new, I suppose, host of the exhibition, quite a few hours were best in show. But to me, it was the impacts of what Buttress Sculpture did, such now with you guys, is Ubuntu Morrissey's big expos, and they all kind of dismantled, thrown away. So I was really kind of keen to have a second black. And this other called Stephen Fleming from the National Bee Association in England, to go on such an aim to talk about the bees and how it's helping us talk about wild bees, not just honey bees, which are kind of experience of significant existential challenges. He wants to talk about his two sons. Both his sons are autistic, quite troubled, and they hate to be touched or to touch, and they make these sounds, these kind of whelping sounds. And he said when he went inside the hive, because of the sound, it was this sound kind of drumming of this seed, we kind of said both of his sons would walk around, touch, and people would kind of touch them, and he said he'd never experienced them be so quiet like in his life. Was so profoundly moving there. And I say this not because of me, that was the bees, but somehow that's what art can kind of do. It can offer up these possibilities, these potentials of things that we know and are unknown. And it was an amazing thing. I think from a practice, it kind of changed everything. And 3 years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, I was invited to look at train sculpture here in the house of this building. And I think the ambition building was amazing. I think what it does signify, what it wanted to do, to talk about meditation, to talk about going into yourself, thinking about things, our connections with the real world, was really amazing. And for me, was working with the architects, I really wanted to do something which expressed a sense of place. And we looked all around the building, and somehow it needed to feel inside the building, but have a connection to it. So it was really interesting with what's open before about water, about how it's not fundamental. It's at that source. We're over 60% water ourselves. And so notes just I started there and probably notes when we first come in a body of water called a Dow. And I thought wouldn't it be amazing science can we connect this body of water with sculptural experience inside the building. And those you can start seeing them in moments. So the water is, which are really amazing things. And what I wanted to do was create almost like a 21st century and using technology. We're using really, really quiet now to express in real time what's happening in the water. Monet done these amazing installations and she was also seeing the static of some part of water is all around you and they transport it to somewhere else. And so I suppose I wanted to take it up one step further. This idea of celebrating and be kind of connected with your senses in water has kind of gone back for thousands and thousands of years. In Rome and Greece, they had these sacred sort of temples, then called an nymphaeum, and they were there to venerate the water gods, the water nymphs. In ancient Greece, the actual blue lotus, water was a hallucinogenic, which you can't sort of take, and it transport you to another world. So this idea of kind of water and water was quite amazing to me. Also, what the thing about water is what happens underneath the water itself. What is unseen? There's a deep kind of mystery to that. So what we did before, what we say in the US, a buoy, and in Indic on oils, it's a buoy, and in this buoy there's a infrared camera as its sensors, which sends a live stream to the room just beyond that wall there, and so whatever's happening in the water is expressed as light and sound within the pixels itself. These were series drawings of water to kind of suggest the composition of the piece. And then in the studio we scanned some water lilies, so we had a 3D scan for water lilies ourselves, and Brendan says like a fashion designer would do with making up a flat piece of cloth that was printed out and drawn on top of each one of these. So we have these hand-drawn sculptural flowers, and then they will kind of put patterns of the modded, and then these were laser etched. So there's 94,000 of these laser etched cast blocks. Each one allows into that between 3 and 4 million laser etches, and when they light, they can glow. This is me walking through the. So as I'm invited to go and kind of look at it, there's a time where let's cook it out. So yeah, this was this short 30-second video which uses the sense of the piece looks with some pillars line. And so the sound in this life is always changing, depending on what's happening in the water itself. If a fish kind of will go past one of its sensors, the retriever sound, and also the retriever light. But also when you're in the space itself, there's a sensor on you, and it creates a shadow bite as you walk around. The whole thing is always changing, it's all inertia. There's a large bench in the centre which you can lie down as these silver prisms. So again, you kind of connect to the drone, you connect to the site and so on. For me, it's been a very beautiful experience, kind of working on it, kind of coming back here, kind of creating something so simple and monkey, with technology is actually easy. And I finish paintings and drawings. So in the perspectives of the Symposium, there's within stations, there's an exhibition we've got in the Yeux du Monde, amazing gallery, about 15 minutes to go. And it's got a lot of the original drawings and paintings, responses to the sculpture, some of the nephew tricks and stuff. So this column should be a lot of fun. And in a way, those sculptures kind of go back to where I first started, talking about back to the kind of 2D. I think the difference between the 2D and the 3D is, for me, it's a conversation between the self, the painting, the art, and it's very much got focus on self, whereas the 3D, the sculptural elements, are so much more about inviting the audience in, thinking about that. And I think that's maybe what artists can sort of do, is just all we can do is try and express kind of our truth, our way in the world. And so it reminds us maybe of who we are, and we weren't born with life's goodness.
So today I'm going to be talking about agency and sense-making and transformative experience. So I'm going to start off with a quick description of sense-making from the enactivist approach in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. So enactivism is among a set of embodied approaches to cognition which emphasize the role of the body as part of the cognitive system. On this view, the activities of our bodies are not just the outputs of cognition, but they have an important either causal role to play in our cognition or themselves cognitive activities. Enactivism in particular emphasizes the role of the body as an autonomous system. So autonomy in this context refers to how a system is organized, and in particular to a structure in which all of the processes within that system are mutually enabling. Living systems have a unique organizational structure in that they distinguish themselves from their environment and maintain themselves through their own activity. Organisms also maintain themselves in precarious conditions. This means that the environment is constantly changing and challenging, such that the processes that constitute an autonomous agent will tend to run down, dissipate, or atrophy in the absence of that agent's own self-generating and maintaining activities. So to maintain itself, an organism needs to interact with its environment and to exchange materials with its environment, but only some interactions with the environment are actually viable, and many others will be harmful or threatening. The organism therefore needs to be able to anticipate beneficial and unbeneficial conditions and regulate its interactions with the environment accordingly. Ensuring this implies the capacity for sense-making. Sense-making is a basic notion of cognition, referring to how an organism interacts with its environment according to the norms established by its own self-maintaining activity. In other words, the organism can distinguish between viable and non-viable interactions and act appropriately to preserve itself. The main point behind this idea, which will be important for my purposes, is that sense-making is the activity through which the organism establishes a perspective on the world. It's because we have a certain kind of bodily organizations, a certain needs, and certain interactions with the environment are good and bad for us, and the things of the world acquire meaning for us. This notion is thus meant to capture how an experiential world emerges from one's identity and one's interactions with the physical environment. So my goal here is to use this basic notion of sense-making as a way of thinking about how our lived world changes in the course of transformative experience, especially an unchosen transformative experience, and to describe one instance of such an experience, grief, in terms of changes to practically significant possibilities. So, transformative experiences are experiences that change your sense of self, values, and how you engage with the world. For example, having a child, falling in love, immigrating, having a serious illness, or losing a loved one are all common transformative experiences. Laurie Paul, the philosopher who popularized the concept, defines a transformative experience as one that is both epistemically and personally transformative. An experience is epistemically transformative when it teaches the agent something that they didn't know prior to having the experience, and it's personally transformative when it changes the agent's experience of themselves and their values and preferences. So transformative experience is one that changes core features of you as an agent and as a decision maker, and that gives you a new perspective on the world that you wouldn't have had otherwise. In this talk, I'm primarily going to be interested in unchosen transformative experiences. These are experiences that the agent didn't choose to undergo, like grief, illness, accident, and war. There goes a distinct problem for our agency. They disrupt individual activities, plans, and expectations that normally scaffold our agency and allow us to sustain our commitments and values. So in an unchosen transformative experience, we have to find a way to rebuild this structure. So here's an example of the sort of deep disruption to your experience of the world and to your projects that happens in an unchosen transformative experience. So it's from a paper by Ken McLaren on grief as an authentic passion. His life was cast in terms of his person, his future, his sense of possibility. His very sense of his place in the world and how he matters was entwined given. Not only his big life projects, but even his everyday routines had her as a condition of their meaningfulness. Eating breakfast, going to bed at night, shopping at the market. With her around, it had been self-evident how to do these things. But without her there to do her part in the dance that awakened those meanings, carved out those routes, and reminded him of his own place, now even breakfast seems unmanageable. The person in question is therefore faced with a crumbling of his world. It can no longer exist with the meanings that it had. So the passage describes a phenomenological change, a disruption to your experience that permeates nearly every aspect of your life, as well as profound disruptions to a person's central set of projects and values. Phenomenologists argue that these two changes are interconnected through our lived body. So Matthew Ratcliffe describes grief as involving the loss of practically significant possibilities that were connected with the other person and the relationship. In a case of goal-directed action, A might do something because B has asked her to do it, because B needs her to do it, because B cares about the outcome so that B can accomplish something else, so that a life share can be sustained or enhanced, and so forth. In many cases, it is not I who does something alone, but we who do it together for reasons that are ours. It is we who care about a given outcome, we who have made and continue to affirm certain commitments, we who depend on each other's support to get things done. The notion of practically significant possibilities is drawn from the phenomenological tradition, which takes our perceptual experience to include a sense of what is possible with respect to a certain object. The possibilities at issue include perceptual possibilities, as when we experience an object as possessing other sides, even when we don't presently see those other sides, as well as the broader set of possibilities for action that are tied to our specific goals and concerns. On Ratcliffe's account of grief, our experience of the world is suffused with a sense of possibilities that are connected to the activities and projects we had with the other person. Their death is then, in very real sense, at odds with how we ordinarily experience the world as meaningful. As Ratcliffe puts it, the practical meanings adhering to various things do not change immediately. We continue to experience his toothbrush, our home, the part where we walk. During the process of grieving, these enduring experiences of practical meanings associated with the person that's dying give rise in turn to experiences of contemplative attention. Grief is transformative when the disruption to one's established projects is great enough so as to require an overall reorganization or reworking. If a person is deeply embedded into the structure of your life, the loss of that person will require thoroughgoing provision of our practical agents. The griever's activity of navigating an unchosen transformative experience is an activity of relearning the world in Thomas Attig's sense. The bereaved person has to relearn their physical surroundings, their commitments and projects, and the relationship with deceased family members and others in their social world. This activity of relearning is over time directed to the many changes and losses that have occurred due to the loss of the other person. We can think of the activity of relearning the world as a sense-making activity. With this idea, I'm characterizing a transformative experience as a perturbation that requires the agent to reestablish a body of meaningful possibilities in new circumstances. Sense-making a transformative experience involves revising habits of thought and action, or what Colin Murray Parse calls our assumptive world. These are the models that we use to navigate the world, from the day-to-day scale of getting out of bed to global assumptions such as the trustworthiness of other people. In the case of grief, for example, the griever may have to redetermine the meaning of very foundational elements of their life, such as their lived space. As Joyce Carol Oates puts it, strange to consider that there would be a home now without my husband, a home to which to take his belongings. Or, in her memoir, Joan Didion's example of walking in Central Park every day with her husband. We did not always walk together because we liked different routes, but we would keep the other's route in mind and intersight before we left the park. What would it mean to go for one's daily walk after the other person's died? Alternately, sense-making can involve very high-level or abstract questions about what it means to still be in a relationship with the other person, or whether any sense or progress can be made of the depth. For example, C.S. Lewis in his memoir Breathing His White Stuff describes how he comes to see bereavement as another phase in their continued relationship. And then one or the other dies. And we think of this as love cut short, like a dance stopped in mid-career, or a flower with its head unluckily snapped off, something truncated and therefore lacking its due shape. I wonder if, as I can't help suspecting, bereavement is a universal and integral part of our experience of love. It follows marriage as normally as marriage follows courtship, or as autumn follows summer. It is not a truncation of the process, but one of its phases. Not the interruption of the dance, but the next figure. Sensemaking as an activity of relearning involves stumbling through these questions of meaning to redetermine the world in the face of the loss. In relation to transformative experience, what the experience means and how it changes the agent are not discovered or revealed so much as they are created. Like the instance of sensemaking for an organism, sensemaking a transformative experience involves an agent reestablishing your perspective on the world by interacting with the world and people.
First of all, I'd like to thank Michael Xi for so generously extending this invitation for me to take part in this. Thank you all for coming out this morning. As you can see, my talk title is rather descriptively called Drifting Toward the Real, and the meaning of this title will come into view as I present. But before I get into it, I'd like to just revisit some of the questions that Michael brought up at the very beginning here. So how can contemplative practices of emerging technologies be coupled to revitalize the human capacity for sense-seeking? What new paradigms for, human consciousness was there too, but human flourishing might emerge from this encounter? So I'm a Buddhist studies scholar, so I'm going to try to address these questions through presenting a case study from some of the contemplative traditions that I study. One in particular called The Great Perfection, or Dzogchen. So this case, as I'll try to show, involves the synthesis and consumption of psychoactive fungi to alter sensory perception with the express goal of disrupting habitual sensory experiences. Defined in Buddhist terms as attachment to ingrained delusional patterns of engagement with sensory objects. So my goal is to put forward this case as one way that Buddhist traditions have combined contemplative practice and what we might call technology, in this case, the kind of biotechnological synthesis of an entheogen, or psychoactive substance, to temporarily disrupt and transform sensory experience toward personal and interpersonal transformation. So in this case, I think I'm going to try to suggest here, obviously people don't disagree with me, of course, is that this has the potential to contribute to research not just on psychedelics, but on this kind of intersection of psychedelics and contemplative practice. So I don't have time to go too deep into the Buddhist background of the case study, but I would like to, the broader Buddhist background of the case study, I should say. But I'd like to just cite a central theme in Buddhist approaches to sensory experience. And that's simply put that Buddhist traditions frame sensory experience in terms of a problematic tension. For contemplatives aimed at psychophysical transformation, Buddhists, sensory engagements are distorted habitual patterns to be overcome. But of course, they're also the fundamental media through which we encounter ourselves, the world, and the contemplative path to begin with, right? So Buddhists enlist a range of different techniques to work with this tension, to dissolve in this tension. Now, while reading what I think is probably a 13th to 14th century commentary on the Great Perfection Heart Essence Tantra called The Only Child of the Teachings, I made the startling discovery of a little-known technique for addressing this tension that involves, of course, as I already mentioned, the cultivation and the consumption of psychoactive fungi in the context of progressing along the Buddhist path. So I describe this as a startling discovery because research in Buddhist studies on the possible use of psychoactive substances among pre-modern Buddhist practitioners has nearly unanimously concluded, prematurely I think, that pre-modern Buddhist traditions never actually enlisted such substances to enhance contemplative experience as part of the Buddhist path. Following this assumption, and research conducted over the past 5 to 10 years on how psychedelics might work in tandem with contemplative practices, researchers have virtually taken it for granted. And some people are really doing this, so you can please correct me if you see that completely way off. Have virtually taken it for granted that psychedelics had never been part of pre-modern Buddhist practice traditions. However, the Tibetan example I'll show you describes precisely how Buddhist practitioners can biosynthesize psychoactive fungi for use in inducing visionary experiences and other sensory disruptions that can hasten progress along the Buddhist path toward awakening. So these are not just sort of tests for realization, so to speak, because we might find them in modern context, but actually integral aspects of the Buddhist path. So the passages in question are part of a commentarial tradition of the heart essence of Vimalamitra, probably the earliest heart essence great perfection tradition in Tibet, or otherwise known as the Yingtik tradition in Tibetan. The passages they appear in chapter 5 of the Tantra. I mean, this is just in Skidder. For those of you who really want to know, you can ask me later. So the path of practice centers on inducing visionary experiences, framed as visual encounters with one's own indwelling wisdom or gnosis. So by enacting special postures in combination with modes of visual gazing, either into a cloudless sky or into pitch darkness of a dark enclosure. By this tradition's account, the Buddhist path involves eliciting and developing visions through 4 phases until this indwelling wisdom which is present in the chest of the body, encoded as 5-fold with 5 dimensions corresponding to 5 colors, as depicted here, until it enters the visual field, actually, and comes out through the eyes and coalesces into a fully immersive 5-fold mandala of awakened Buddha bodies, which by different accounts either dissolve into emptiness at the end or stabilize and remain at its culmination. So this is an image of the progression of these visionary experiences as the tradition kind of normally depicts it, without the use of the psychoactive fungi, right? So you can see, going from left to right, how first sort of patterns and colors emerge through these different postures, and then moving toward the right, these coalesce and organize themselves into mandala patterns until we get the sort of fully formed version of these 5 Buddhas in the mandala pattern. So after describing the sequence of practice, the Tantra, this ordinary for its own self-depiction sequence of practice, the Tantra outlines a more immediate approach to inducing visionary experiences through ingesting so-called medicines, rather than through the more arduous processes you can see here of holding the postures, gazing into the sky, or pitch black darkness for hours, days, or weeks on end. So the Tantra states, the root text upon which the commentary is based, that since the fruition is not attained immediately, all at once, become adept in the vision step by step. One should thus apply suitable medicines. We might interpret this as drugs, actually. Connected with 5 sensory gateways, such as eye or visual medicine, and so forth. So that's all it says, the root text. The commentary, what it makes of it is quite remarkable, though. So the commentary offers instructions for utilizing a range of medicinal substances to alter sensory perceptions. Starting with sight, the commentary then addresses in turn how to produce liminal experiences of sound, scent, taste, and touch. So on the section centering on sight, we have a division into colors and shapes. The subsection on colors prescribes mixing together. I won't go through all this, don't worry. It's described. I just wanted to give some sense of it here in the colored section, what you're supposed to do and what you're supposed to mix. Mixing together these substances, bearing them for 21 days or longer until a chorus blue fuzz appears. Then we're told that the pills are to be formed from this fungal concoction, and the pills are to be painted yellow, blue, red, white, and green in turn. And then the pills are to be ingested with the aim of producing visions of a corresponding dimension of fivefold wisdom, or jnana in Sanskrit, yeshe in Tibetan, in this order. So you have your visual field is supposed to completely transform into the color of the pill, essentially. Keep to one or another aspect of this fivefold wisdom. So the recipe actually does not list any known psychoactive substance, only the growth of fungus and its ingestion. It's more. But lest we presume that this couldn't possibly refer to psychoactive fungus, which is what I thought when I first read this passage, I'd like to just kind of alert us to the sheer diversity of psychoactive spores across the world with reference to Paul Stamets' eye-opening 1996 guide, pictured here, and with reference to the ongoing discovery of psychoactive fungi as recently as this year by this West Virginia University undergraduate student. So I'd like to just, ask that UVA undergrads please step up your game. There's a competition across the mountains. So more conclusive evidence that these pills do in fact comprise psychoactive fungus comes in the shapes section that follows this. So here we find a recipe for synthesizing fungus from a combination of the psychoactive substance of datura, which is a known psychoactive substance, and other substances such as ransandalwood, white lotuses, and beer. Now, after keeping the datura mixture buried for a month until little hairs the size of mustard seeds cover it in upright clumps, the concoction is to be made into pills and consumed with a range of other substances to transform one's visual field accordingly. The commentary states that taking the pill in association with other images and substances will fill one's visual field with the relevant images. So these images include, strangely enough, weapons, tigers specifically, or any other animal of choice, earth, fire, wind, water, space, meditation, deity forms, ilap deities, for those of you who can know about Tibetan meditation, rainbow light with meditation forms, so like the ones we saw pictured in the image I showed you, and other desired objects. So the text then goes on to prescribe the preparation of special substances for the senses of sound, sense, taste, and touch, aimed at producing a range of different experiences, like cognition not engaging with anything else. This is just live translations of what the text says. Being naturally still, or becoming naturally still and understanding the meaning of the expansive sound, hearing the sounds of gods, hell beings, and animals, the experience of bliss and non-conceptuality, and settling in meditative absorption naturally. So the section concludes by affirming that through such techniques, the practitioner will, quote, turn away the attachments connected with five sensory gateways and attain awakening while enjoying the five sense pleasures. It thus affirms that these methods of producing altered or liminal sensory perceptions are expressly for integrating the sense pleasures onto the path, for becoming free of the attachment connected with the five gateways and attaining awakening, right, enlightenment, phylactery of the tradition. So to briefly revisit the section on inducing visions, it's noteworthy that the expected results quite closely resemble the 10 kashinas of the Pali Buddhist tradition. The kashinas are detailed in the Visuddhimagga of Buddhaghosa and the Vimuttimagga of Bupratissa, these Pali texts, as techniques of concentration in which 10 objects are taken as reference points in turn until one's entire visual field is filled with nothing but the object. Starting with earth and ending with infinite consciousness, and including, as you can see here, the other elements of water, fire, and wind, the four colors of blue, yellow, white, and red, and infinite space. The Great Perfection version of our commentary includes several idiosyncratic variations, such as 5 colors instead of 4, keying them to the 5 forms of wisdom, and adding things like, under the category of shape, like weapons, animals, deity images, and rainbow lights. The most significant difference is, of course, the psychoactive fungi. So it's worth mentioning that an important rubric in psychedelic research that pertains here too is the observation that set, or orienting mindset, and setting, or environment and physical comportment,
are important factors for directing sensory and cognitive channels toward desired effects and experiences. So although we cannot be sure that the recipes in this commentary were ever, in fact, followed, we can nonetheless observe that its author or authors were at the very least seriously imagining how psychoactive substances could work in tandem with contemplation, and in so doing were acutely aware of the rubric of mindset and environmental setting in shaping desired experiences and outcomes. So this awareness is most conspicuously reflected in the use of its orienting substances, whose colors, shapes, and images suggest themselves into the desired visual experience, loosely in keeping with the 10 kashinas of the early Buddhist tradition, but cast in a kind of great perfectional tantric light. Set and setting are determined further by all the framing concepts and preliminary practices, which I couldn't really get into because of time here, of going for refuge to the three jewels, generating bodhicitta, altruistic intention to reach awakening for the sake of all beings, and other things. And finally, on the topic of set and setting, I would just like to add that Buddhist traditions in general have been adept at utilizing set and setting to achieve contemplative and ritual aims, and more broadly, the ritual theorists in religious studies have long observed how the demarcation of actions through specialized framing strategies, such as the formation of special intentions, the repetition of special prayers, the use of special venues, apparel, and sensory experiences, are intrinsic to what constitutes ritual action across times and cultures. So establishing set and setting then are simply part of what we do when we perform rituals, actually, with psychedelic use and Buddhist practice being but two instances. So I'd like to just conclude by opening this case study for discussion with the following broader questions in mind. Of course, Devin will lead us into a discussion with broader still questions, but these coming out of this kind of discovery that I made, how might such traditional Buddhist examples contribute to research on the therapeutic uses of psychoactive fungi and the ways in which synergies between psychedelics and contemplative practice might be leveraged to enhance human flourishing? How might bringing in Buddhist perspective shed light on the potential promises and perils, and how set and setting could figure? And how might the combination of psychedelics and contemplative practice work with emergent technological enhancements in the domains of AI, VR, design, architecture, and the arts to help create new and diversely tailored paradigms of human flourishing? Thanks.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. I'm going to tell you a little bit, following on from James's talk. I'll explain how what I'm going to talk about is kind of a first-person experience of ayahuasca-assisted contemplative deity yoga. That's a sort of experiment that I did, and I'll talk about that. The first thing I'd like to do is just say thank you so much to all the work that's gone into organizing this, especially Michael and Devin and Adam and Mac, or most of the people that I've been interacting with. And so I just like to say it's a lot of work to put something like this together. And something I know I'm not very good at, for example, so I'm in awe of people that are good at it. So thank you so much for such a wonderful event and the ability to engage with so many interesting people. And so I'm going to talk a bit about a project that's been evolving over the last few years. But before I do, I just want to, the talk's called Tara Pachamama. It's very much a sort of cross-cultural interweaving of sort of contemplative ideas from Eastern traditions on the one hand, and then South American traditions on the other. So let me just start by defining Tara and Pachamama, because they're often mistranslated. So Tara is often translated as star, which is a good translation, but it actually means one who crosses over. And so we all know the word Tara, actually, because a lot of us use the word avatar. And so avatar is going down, crossing over. And so the stars were referred to as Tara in Sanskrit because they cross over the sky. Pachamama is a word in Quechua, which is one of the many indigenous languages of Peru, which is often translated as Madre Tierra or Mother Earth. But really, the Pacha part has a much more cosmic dimension to it. And so I think actually Cosmic Mother is a much better translation. And so I'm going to be telling you about the sort of combination of ayahuasca with deity yoga. And so maybe some of you have seen this image. This is like the classic image that like almost every talk I've ever seen on deity yoga has this image in it. It shows contemplative sitting on a platform somewhere in the mountains, visualizing a deity dissolving into light. And so deity yoga is a sort of classic Vajrayana contemplative practice, which involves visualizing a deity as dissolving into energy, visualizing yourself as dissolving into energy, and then you can inhabit, sort of change perspectives of the deity, and then see the world through the lens of compassion and wisdom that deity sort of represents. So in the experiments that I'll talk about, I'm going to talk about sort of psychedelic, specifically ayahuasca-assisted deity yoga. And it looks something like this. This was one of the people that was down in Peru during the time that I was living there, sort of engaged in an open eyes visualization practice of this Tara as it was emerging at this ayahuasca retreat center. And so just for a brief bit of context, so James talked about the use of psychedelics to sort of enhance contemplative practice, and I'm going to talk about sort of first-person lived experience of doing exactly that thing over a period of a year and a half. And so during December 2022 to May 2024, I was basically living most of the time in the upper Amazon in Peru, in a place called Jaén, which is near the border with Ecuador. And I kind of find myself there through... I mean, the story behind that there is really crazy, but basically I was at home after COVID with my parents and I was really bored, and then there was an opportunity to go to Peru to try ayahuasca with someone I'd never heard of. And because I'm engaged with psychedelic research, I thought it was probably time that I tried it. I was actually very disparaging of it because most of the people that I met, I lived in San Francisco, I worked at Stanford for 3 years, and most of the people that I met that had taken ayahuasca in Peru were people I wouldn't want to spend time with. And so I was actually quite disparaging of it. But anyway, I was really bored, and I was having cabin fever. I'm the oldest of 6, and we were all at home post-COVID, locked in. And so I bought a flight the next day and flew down to Peru to meet this lady. This is Maria Cristina Mendoza Vidal. She's a sort of ayahuasquera in the mestizo tradition. She's this one, by the way. And anyway, so one thing led to the next. And if you know me, you kind of know that my life kind of works in this way. But I sort of found myself living there, going in the jungle, cutting the vines, making ayahuasca, learning the songs, cooking the ayahuasca with Christina. I mean, this is some proper witchcraft in this photo. This is an ayahuasca vine. You have to pound it. It's so much work to pound the vines. And then these are the chacruna leaves, to wash the leaves and make a big tea in big pots. And maybe people know, but ayahuasca is made from 2 different plants. It's made from a plant called chacruna, which is actually a relative coffee plant, only grows at higher elevations near where coffee grows. That contains DMT. There's many different leaves you can use to get the DMT. You can use another plant called chaliponga. There's different plants that contain DMT. The ayahuasca itself, if I give you a cup full of boiled chacruna and you drink it, it won't affect you, because it gets metabolized in your body really quickly before it can have an effect. So you could literally drink chacruna tea all day long and you wouldn't feel a thing. But when I combine it with ayahuasca, it has inhibitors which basically lock up the enzyme that normally metabolizes the DMT. So it has a longer lifetime in your body, and then it can do its magic. And so a typical ayahuasca experience lasts 4 to 6 hours. And there's something really important to say here. So when you go into the jungle, there's a lot of vines that look like ayahuasca, but like a lot of them are not characterized. And so this particular vine that we harvested, it looked like ayahuasca. So you can kind of recognize ayahuasca by its cross-section like this. It looks like that. But this particular medicine, and I don't have a photo of it, was a really, really bright red color. And this particular medicine was called ritmo, which is in Spanish means rhythm. And this medicine did not last 46 hours. It lasted about 30 hours. So you would typically start the ceremony about 6 p.m. is when Christina, the ayahuasca, would start the ceremonies. And you would be tripping for the whole next day. And you would finally be down by the 2 nights after you took it. And so this wasn't conventional Banisteris copy, which is the normal plant that's used for ayahuasca. That's clear. We have a few. I've actually talked to some ethnobiologists about what we think this plant was, and there's 2 candidate species we think it was. The lead candidate think it was something called muricata because of the time duration and the intensity. And so anyway, Christina fed this medicine, so groups would come down occasionally to take ayahuasca at her house, and she would give this medicine. She would, try her new medicine out on the group. She would always try it. We would always try it ourselves first, but just a tiny bit. And we tried this medicine. We're like, whoa, that's strong. But we'll try it with the group. And she gave it to the group, and it was like complete carnage. So she never gave it to the group again. But I liked it a lot, so she just kept giving it to me because nobody else wanted to drink it. And it kept you awake for a long time. You didn't really sleep very much. And, through whatever turn of events, I ended up drinking this stuff for 6 weeks every other day and making art. And so if you want to know what a person on ayahuasca making art looks like, it looks something like that. And so I was visualizing this Tada during this process. And so I had mostly would be painting when I was down. So it's hard to paint very specifically when you're going full blast. But I would visualize in that state of mind, always with my eyes open. So I had a cushion and I would sit in front and I would visualize. And then when I was able to hold a brush or do more technical things, I would do that. And as the Tara evolved, Christina started holding ayahuasca ceremonies with people with the Tara, because this Tara was such a presence for people. And it was really great. I had a studio. I had brought a bunch of computers. I have projectors. I do a lot of digital art. I was writing software. I would do a lot of the design, kind of tweaking things digitally. I had an 8-channel sound system in this hut in the jungle. It was a scene. It was totally rad. It was all the ayahuasca you drink effectively. That's your thing. I mean, I have to say, after a while, my body did really change. So I didn't suffer the same nausea that you normally have, right? After a certain period, it's your body sort of acclimates to it. This is an image of the Tada. Oh, Java, up here. This is an image of the Tada with the light circle. With the Tada sort of with the light from the jungle filtering through the trees, shining on her. And I have a time-lapse video that shows the making of. I won't go through that now because we're short on time. But I just have a few observations I wanted to highlight from that time, which I think are interesting. The first is the difference between. So a lot of psychedelic psychotherapy in the modern context is this. If you look up psychedelic psychotherapy, this is the image you see: people with earphones and eye shades laying there. And a lot of the narrative for psychedelic use at the moment has to do with going inside yourself with your eyes closed to block out sensory stimulation, to focus on your own, heal your trauma. And you sort of seal off light by focus on this interiority. Very much like Wolf said when he gave his talk, that when he was younger, he sort of thought everything was within him. And then he kind of realized he's a conduit for connection with everything else that there is. And I found that when people would come, occasionally when people were on ayahuasca, they would wander into my hut with the Tada, and they would have to open their eyes or they couldn't see the Tada. And that was such a massive transformation for people to go from the sort of narrative of sort of self-narrative of like, in a sense, drowning in the darkness of your own trauma versus opening your eyes and then allowing yourself to be a conduit for light to flow through. And this was a massive change for many people in how they thought about ayahuasca and for myself. The second thing is, I think Pierre said it really nicely in his meditation. You said the light that you see is the light that sees within you. And it's exactly that idea. The second thing is Tara's dark eyes. So if you look at Tara, you see she has dark eyes. And there was a very specific moment when I was visualizing her where she said to me, my eyes should be dark because they should be a window into infinite possibility. And I have my PhD in sort of computational physics. And when we think about the wave function, which is a function that represents infinite potential, we say the wave function collapses into a particular spatial temporal instantiation. And so I started meditating on darkness actually being an aesthetic representation of infinite potential. And so when you look into her eyes, you can see her eyes not as black, not as nothing, but actually everything. So if you imagine a canvas and you draw an infinite number of drawings on that canvas, it will eventually become black because black represents everything. And so when you look at her, you can see her eyes as that way. And so I actually wrote a whole paper. I wrote the first draft of this paper while I was on ayahuasca in Heidelberg. And if you look at the acknowledgments, I acknowledge my shorimo in the acknowledgments for this paper. And this paper actually forms the basis for all the virtual reality stuff I'm working on with Michael up in the CIRCL lab. So it just goes to show you can do good work in this state. I should say I did like the final edits when I was not on ayahuasca. But the third thing I want to say is a lot of people who had come to see this Tara and Peru were people that didn't know about deity yoga, they didn't know about Tara, and they're just like, what is going on here? But they were attracted to her energy. And so I guess I developed like a really simple instruction to help people contemplate this Tara, and it was this. I would tell people, as you softly gaze on Tara, imagine she's an energetic mirror that reflects back at you elements of wisdom and compassion which radiate from yourself. And so this idea of looking at the artwork not as an object that's external, but rather looking at it as a mirror that's a reflection of you transformed people's perspective to her, especially under the influence of Las Plantas. So in conclusion, the project that is upstairs, which you can go see in 4A if you want to see it, is I kind of witnessed the transformative potential this Tara have for people. And so but the problem is you have to go to Peru. It's like a 3-day trip. It's like such a pain to get there. So it's like, well, how do we make Tara be able to travel? And so what we've done is we've constructed her from 1,500 laser cut pieces of aluminum, each of which are hand painted, which I've been developing. I have an art studio in the northern mountains of Portugal in woods, ancient oak forest at the side of the river. And over the last 2 months I've been developing this Tara. And so this gives you a sense, all the pieces are hand painted, and she's here in UVA. So if you want to go see her, you can go see her. This is the first time she's ever been installed outside for people that are not me on acid in Portugal making this thing. And I remember when I first put her out on the canvas, like this was the image, like the sun came and just shone immediately on her crown chakra, like she's magic. And we extended the psychedelic protocol to, I don't have access to ayahuasca in Portugal because ayahuasca doesn't grow in Europe, but there's other stuff. And so this is what it looks like when people are doing that protocol. So it's if anyone wants to come to northern Portugal and contemplate Tara, have a good protocol. I just want to show a really quick video. So, yeah, thanks so much. And I thought it was just nice to follow from James, because you can see that it's a really great combination.
As we wait for some folks to kind of trickle in, thank you again to our presenters for this fantastic panel of, really diverse and interesting presentations. So I kind of thought, we had a chance to talk earlier this year about these presentations and some of the themes emerging from them. I kind of wanted to start with what is, for me, the big question of this conference and one of the big questions of this panel, which is kind of what does it mean to think of sensing and sensation as a way of knowing the world? Or perhaps more accurately, what happens when we take seriously the senses as a way of knowing the world? And are we taking the senses seriously enough as it is? So I kind of wanted I'll open that up to anyone who feels prepared to answer that question, and then take it from there.
Hello? Hi. Yes. So as an artist, I suppose it's fundamental, to engage with the senses. You're inspired, you use them, but I think some of the interesting things which is coming out of this morning, which I think we all kind of touched on in our own way, was this idea of how one experiences senses through your own body, through yourself, and then somehow when one experiences senses collectively, how different that becomes. We talked before just about shutting your eyes, not shutting your eyes. Say, for example, when you're dancing, if you have your eyes shut or open, as soon as they're open, you with other people, you feel everything different, you see everything different. So I kind of think that's an interesting maybe sort of thing to talk a little bit about, just the sense of ego. I think that, and kind of putting that to one side. And I think sometimes we're talking about taking, psychedelic drugs to kind of go through in a way that is kind of getting into who you are, but also letting go of ego and what kind of truths it kind of reveals.
Well, like I mentioned this in the presentation I gave, but maybe I just come back to close the circle a little bit. But Pierre, in his meditation, you said, I love the line you said about the light that you see is that which sees within you, and so I think you could extend that to all the sensory modalities, and then it's a dissolution of the conventional, imagining that there is something out there that's separate from yourself, but recognizing that the form, the physiological structure of your sensory apparatus, the shape of your body, is completely continuous with what you perceive in the world. And so, I mean, you can, so if we extend Pierre's metaphor a little bit farther, you could say, well, the sun is shining on me, or you could say, I am shining the sun, right? And it's really interesting to kind of do that sort of conceptual flip with other sensory modalities, right? Like the sensation of warmth from the sun is the interaction of your sort of physical structure with vibrational radiation, right? I mean, that's what constructs the sun. And so I think, and that takes us into the sort of contemplative technologies that James was talking about, where you use this recognition and tools to enhance this recognition to dissolve this sort of subject-object distinction.
Yeah, thanks. That, from a Buddhist perspective, of course, we have a problem with our senses, a kind of really deep, ingrained problem in that we bifurcate experience precisely along the lines that David described, and that we attribute qualities to sensory experiences and objects that they don't really have. So this idea of disrupting, or I mean, you could say reprogramming, or I mean, all kinds of metaphors we could use to get to this process, is really fundamental to the Buddhist project, the contemplative project. And you could, I mean, Buddhist theorists have sort of even imploded all of the Buddhist teachings according to the ways in which they do that, or the ways in which they frame a relationship with sensory experiences. So the one that I was talking about is from this perspective of allowing the sensory channels to remain wide open. So the meditation involves not closing the eyes, not blocking off the senses in any way whatsoever. But there are many others where you go into seclusion, right? And you close the eyes, you sort of retreat to a quiet place where there's limited, kind of attenuated sensory stimuli. And so we can just sort of imagine that as a spectrum, I think, for taking the senses seriously. How would we do that? We would sort of see where we are on that spectrum, and we can float between them too. So what do we need, really, to kind of take our senses seriously in this moment? Are we oversaturated? Do we need to recluse? Or do we need to just kind of blow the channels through a very radical kind of disruption?
Sure. I was thinking of something much more basic that kind of takes a step back, just in terms of how the lived world of different animals is shaped by the sense organs that they have and the motor outputs that they're capable of doing. And that what things even show up for you are a function of what sensory capacities you have, and how you can then make distinctions in the world given those sensory capacities, and what motor capabilities you have and how those are connected together. And that is literally how objects show up for you. So there's an ecological psychologist named Jakob von Ueskel who has this very creepy passage kind of about the phenomenology of a tick, and how it's like hangs on to a branch, and then when it smells butyric acid, it drops off the branch and onto the body of the mammal, and then the warmth of the mammal turns off the olfactory signal, and then it starts to drink the blood of the mammal. But it's basically like, what is the ontology of this tick? It's like, oh, scent signal, possible food source, warmth, initiate, eat, so it's like what shows up in the lived world is a function of our sense organs. And then, yeah, I mean, with the connection to Buddhism, this is more about the sensory habits that we can have, and how changing that is going to change your experience of the world.
It's like something that seems maybe relevant to highlight is, so when I've done presentations in the past, one thing I've provocatively offered is that transforming the traditional Cartesian frame, I think, therefore I am. Instead, if you want another simple slogan is just I am a site of perception. It's literally changing that. Instead of this sort of agency, I do, therefore, and think, we know, actually comes from the same Latin root as the word thing. So the practice of thinking is actually the practice of thinging, right? It's creating objects continuously, as opposed to just being a site of perception. And I'd be really interested to hear what Jelena, I guess you in particular, think about that as a philosopher, as a sort of repulse to Descartes in that sense.
I guess it's a different vision of what cognition is. It's not meant to, at least what I'm taking from you, it's not meant to, cognition isn't this sort of abstract representation of things that there are in the world, but the first thing that cognition is for action and sensing, and that's the reason why we have cognition in the first place. So it's bringing cognition back to its more foundational, basic elements, and the sort of tell us the purpose for which we have it in the first place. Yeah, that's my sort of.
Can I just,
Yeah, please,
if I just
yeah.
have one something. Just that, I mean, somehow I'm representing the Buddhists. I hope that's okay for Buddhists in the audience. But just to mention that the mental consciousness is actually the mind, the mental faculty, and mental objects are included among the 5. I mean, there's 6 sensory channels in the Buddhist tradition. So the mental domain is something that's sort of just aligned with the other 5 in a grouping, rather than above and beyond them as a kind of, index to a self, you could say.
Thanks. I want to remind folks that they can use this, they can ask questions via the screen using the QR code or something else. We'd love to hear from the audience. But before that, I certainly in all of your presentations and a little bit in the discussion, we've started to talk about this question of disruption. All of your presentations included something about the kind of transformation of the sensorium in some way, this kind of disruption, this sensing otherwise, whether it's kind of from like through sculptural immersive art or through substances or through the transformations that happen in grief experiences. I would just love to hear about what you think as a kind, like as part of a discussion about the what happens when we sense otherwise, when we attend to this problem of the senses, to use what James just said in terms of the Buddhist perspective. How do disruptions of the senses help us, change us?
So I kind of think in a small way, is if you are kind of aware of your senses, like fully, you kind of feel alive, you feel in tune, you feel like in the moment, you feel present. And I think one of the things that can really do and can really help is it makes you more empathetic. You have empathy and a love for the world, And say, for example, I'll just go back to what I was talking about before, like bees. Some people might find bees as small, irritating, they might want to sting you and stuff. But if you think actually what they are, what they contribute just as an organism in themselves, are absolutely incredible. But if you know they feel pain, if you know they communicate, if you know that how beneficial they are, you'll change your perception of the world. And that's through senses, being aware of your senses and just kind of focusing in on that. So I would sort of say at the moment, by being more aware of that, the world could really do with it at the moment.
I mean, I don't know if Michael's here, but in his opening presentation, and Jelena mentioned it a bit, he talked about the sort of spectrum of radiation that the human sensory apparatus is designed for. And so, we see a tiny fraction of visible light, we hear a tiny auditory range, and then we sort of inscribe that as being we become very attached to that definition of what is real, and that is real for us operationally with the structure of our bodies in the world and what we can do. But it's also good to occasionally just like poke holes in the fabric, right? I think so when you have disruptive events, I don't know, Andrew Holachek's here spending 6 weeks in the dark, or taking ayahuasca for a long time, or, going into a sensory immersion tank, or using deity yoga, psychedelic-assisted deity yoga, or what have you, holotropic breathing, all these mechanisms, or even doing things like, anything that's a departure from the typical sensory sort of domain of your normal life is good, because it just problematizes that and helps you become less attached to that. And one thing I noticed a lot was in Peru, during that time I spent there, was time changed so dramatically. I was there for, when I would be there for 1 month, it felt like 10 years. And I've tried to think about why that is, actually, in a more contemplative way. And so when I was actually making the Tada in Portugal at the studio, I noticed it slowed down, not as dramatically. Maybe 1 month felt like 3 years instead of 10 years. But I've been trying to think about why that is. And my best conclusion, and I offer this to other people who maybe if you've had this experience, but my best hypothesis for why this is that well, first of all, in that situation, I'm not checking my watch or my phone, and I don't have meetings. And so time is perfectly in rhythm with the natural cycles of what's happening around me. And I realize that when I'm not in that situation, I'm basically living my life enslaved to a collective abstraction that we all agree upon, which is the clock. But there is no clock. Like, we agree a clock because it's a way to, like, you know, build buildings and have meetings and do Zoom calls and build airplanes and, you know, shoot missiles and all these kinds of things, right? But there is no clock. It's an abstraction that we enslave ourselves to. And when you get rid of that abstraction, you just notice that time completely dilates, right? It completely changes. And it expands out. And then you get a bit closer to this sense of the eternal now. Just about like putting your watch down, stopping having meetings, and just being in the sort of natural cycles. And so, you know, this is an example of experiencing this. You don't have to do anything, drugs or anything crazy. You just like be in nature for 2 weeks. Away from everything and not be enslaved to that form of abstraction. And I think to carry that further, there's all kinds of other ways where you could do this kind of sort of disruptive, it's like almost like a disruptive technology. I'm sure Andrew's not checking his watch when he's in the dark for 3 weeks at a time.
But it's a little bit, you know, when you're a kid, you know, the school holidays, I don't know how long you have it here in the US, but like in the UK, we have like 6 weeks when you're 7, 8, 9 for the summer holidays, and those 6, 7 weeks feel like an eternity because every day is like an adventure, you know, and every time you sense the new things, you're experiencing new things because you feel alive, you feel aware, and I think it's kind of that, and yet time becomes immaterial. I think when you're doing the same thing day in, day out, you know, if you're, you know, working a job you really don't like, you know, I mean, time goes really fast, but it's crap, and you go, shit, where did the year go? But it's just trying to fill your lives where you are connected and you're using your senses.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so your question was about disruption, and I mean, yeah, I was thinking about the different valence that disruption has, because it was kind of more negatively valenced in my talk than everyone else's talk. Because I mean, like, we go through alternating periods of disruption and stability, and there's a reason why our stable cognitive structures and habits exert such a force on us and exert such a gravity that we want to stay in them, because they do facilitate our lives. Like it's enormously cognitively demanding to go through a disruptive experience. So like reworking all of these cognitive structures and all of these habits is enormously demanding. So there's a reason we don't want to do that in most of our lives. Yeah.
And then what happens when we do? I think your paper spoke to this most directly, but do you want to say a few words? Okay.
Well, I put it in a pretty neutral way. Like, my metaphor was kind of more homeostatic. Like, there's certain sort of core projects that you have, and they're built into your life through these, including like, you know, physical habits and habits of thought. But then that become unworkable because of this external event. And then you have to sort of rebuild them. But I put that, I mean, like, it happens because you have to do it. But these, you know, technologies and these experiences are ones that are initiated by the person who's, I mean, this speaks to your intention and setting points. Like, these are ones that are initiated by the person. Because William James also talks about this in his book on conversion experiences, like this idea that sometimes our habits and our ideas become stale to us, and they keep going along mechanically. yeah, you'll have read it. And they keep going along mechanically, even though they're sort of losing their emotional value for us. And then something happens that shifts us and makes us want to reorganize those systems.
Yeah, thank you. James, did you? have more to say.
Yeah, this the unwelcome disruptions. Your talk really made me think about those and how they're tied to a different kind of reordering process of the senses. And I mean, for those of us, probably all of us here, have experienced some major rupture personally or collectively as part of a collective. And I mean, your sense of time changes, your sense of who you are, of course, but just the basic sensory modalities, I think, change as well. And then reordering that unwelcome kind of disruption of what happens. Sometimes it can be, of course, it can open things and things can become very positive as a result of that clearing that takes place, that's formed from it. But this, whether something's intentional or not, the disruption of the senses can be, itself can be tragic. I mean, having gone through a major earthquake myself, this kind of just what happens to you, to your sensory modalities and how you can cope with that and reorder things. Yeah, you want to get back to that ingrained sensibility very quickly. So these deliberate interventions are of a different order, but somehow we can think about them along a continuum maybe, or in connection. It's really, but your talk of grief really opened that up for me. So I really, appreciate that.
And, I'd like to ask you one question, actually. You talk about disruption. It's about crowd surfing that handles Messiah.
Talk about that later.
Should we hear some audience questions?
Okay, a regular meditative practice seems very non-disrupting, yet so beneficial. Historically, is disruption necessary for enlightenment?
Is there an enlightenment expert?
Is anyone in the audience enlightened? We can. I'm the resident Buddhist sort of stand-in. I'm very far from enlightened, but I would say radical disruption is necessary from the ingrained habitual patterns. Yes, if the practice is making you comfortable, maybe there's something wrong. That's just my personal opinion, and I mean the textual tradition as well tends to kind of support the notion that we're not really doing contemplative practice from a Buddhist perspective to feel good and to kind of adapt. It's sort of a maladaptive, disruptive strategy, rather.
Can I ask a question? Is this because, on this perspective, our intuitive ways of approaching the world are delusional?
Yes, yeah, that's the diagnosis.
I mean, when the topic of enlightenment comes up, it's always funny, right? I think Krishnamurti said, when people would ask him how to become enlightened, he would say, have you been enlightened? And they would say no. And then they'd go, well, then how do you even know you want it? And so I guess that's what I always think of, is like, am I sure that's even the thing I want if I don't know what it's like? But I think it's just a projection of everything you think that could possibly be the perfect thing, and that's why you think you want it. But in any case, so radical sensory deprivation definitely makes for interesting people to talk to, like that I would say. But on the other hand, then having the relational contrast of, and I think the reason it does is because it helps you problematize the conventional structures that you sort of assume to be real, right? So when you talk to people that have undergone these things, then it's interesting. But I guess the other point about disruption is there's a lot of hype within the psychedelic contemplative community at the moment to pursue disruption as something that's always good. Mm-hmm. It's not always good. Yeah. Sometimes it's profoundly disruptive, and sometimes the effects of it are only obvious much farther down the line. Like something you think may be good may not be so good as you evolve through the years, and something you think was not good can actually be good. And something that you think was unintentional in terms of a disruptive experience, you sometimes realize was intentional, and sometimes you think was intentional may turn out to be unintentional, right? So it's very difficult to know exactly, you know, what the sort of structural topology of a disruption is. But definitely here, there's a lot of people that have probably had really interesting disruptive experiences. So I would encourage everyone here to like get some good stories.
In grief, an unchosen transformative experience, what type of contemplation do you guys recommend?
In grief? For me, it's probably listening to some kind of like drone music, kind of. Like music itself, like sound. Always kind of reminds you, it has this amazing sort of thing that you're always in the moment when you listen to a song, like a sound. It's always like, it doesn't have a memory or a kind of future. But that kind of changes when you sometimes listen to kind of drone music, because you have a memory of what went before and you've probably got a good idea of what's going to be coming next. So to kind of really kind of focus and free your mind and to make things, especially if it's a drone, which is kind of makes you feel good, you know, it's not too dark. For me, that's always really helpful.
Yeah, personally, it's been empathy and compassion, trying to develop that. Of course, you can do that for yourself, the grieving person, but it's also very helpful to get out of very self-destructive patterns of thought when grieving, to really focus on the suffering of others. So, and then, I mean, part of that, I think, too, in the Buddhist imaginary, you can think of the suffering of different classes of beings, you know, like we were talking about bee existence and tick existence and these other modes of existence, kind of training the imagination to think through or feel even, as much as we can do that, their reality and what might cause them to suffer or feel pleasure.
People are creating deep fakes of their deceased relatives. What can phenomenology tell us about this technological resurrection?
That's awesome. People are creating deep fakes of their deceased relatives. What can phenomenology tell us? Yeah, I honestly think a lot more empirical work, well, any empirical work, first of all, needs to be done to see how people relate to these avatars. To see how people relate to these avatars. So there's, so one way you could think about it is as like a sort of scaffolding for an imaginative connection with your deceased loved one. So one way to think about what happens in the grieving process is you maintain this continued connection with the deceased person, and you could think of that as, you know, imaginatively facilitating an ongoing connection with that person. And maybe for some people that could be helpful as a form of closure, or to still be able to, you know, tell them things that were left unresolved or something like that. And, you know, in that sense, you could see it as on a continuum of different practices that we have for connecting with the deceased person. What is interesting about it is that it's generative, right? Like that's supposed to be the point. And all of the other sort of technologies that we have usually have a fixed set of information from the person that doesn't change, right? You have their journals, you have photos of them, and those are kind of fixed in a certain place. But this allows you to generate a new, like novel sort of information that's supposed to be sort of inspired by that person or the sort of response that they would give to you. So the sort of rosy picture is as a way of facilitating an ongoing connection. The very non-rosy picture is that it could, in some aspects, replace your relationship with a deceased person. So they have a certain role in your life, and you sort of get this avatar to fulfill some of those roles. And the worry is, oh, will the person actually, will it impede the grieving process because you actually don't have to grieve because you still have them? And in some sort of way. And then another sort of worry is, this is expressed in a different way in C.S. Lewis's memoir, where he talks merely about his memories of his deceased wife. And he says, slowly, like snowflakes, falling, my impressions of her cover over the real age. So he's worried that the way that he's framed things in his mind, what he finds to be salient, are sort of the intermediary, and he loses her real otherness. Like he's just sort of stuck in his own mind. So you could, I could definitely see a very, very parallel worry with the avatars, right? How you frame the person, what you find to be salient about them is now being reshaped through this interaction that you have with this entity. And then of course there's the connection with the this is where are they getting this data from and who owns it, and it's also mediated through this, company that maybe has its own other purposes and so on and so. So anyways, those are like the rosy picture and the not so rosy picture.
So I think in a sense, we're always creating representation of the deceased. That's something new. Like if you go to the gravestone of a deceased and you leave flowers and you bring pictures, or sometimes when my mother is together with her brothers and sisters in a certain social environment, they'll talk about what would he have done in this situation? What would he have said? And so there's a constant reconstruction of what would that person have done in this situation that lives in memory. So in a sense, a deep fake just kind of lives along that trend of that continuum. Just see it as like another technology. The question for me is it good art? Like, a shrine and a gravestone and candles and flowers is really nice art. Is a crappy video you stick on YouTube, is it good art? Maybe it is. I haven't seen it. So and then what's the artistic impact of it on the people that experience it? So I think I would frame it in a much more practical question is it aesthetically good?
The most important normative question.
Yeah, I just want to also note the way that sensing relates to this directly. In addition to what David just said about kind of the aesthetic value of these deep fakes that are being created, there's also something in what Jelena was sharing that to create this person, this deep fake, this avatar that only has a certain data set that it's based on, and then the only kind of input that it gets from there is the conversation with one person, really is not, it loses, this being loses the power of the influence of the senses, the embodied influence of being a person in the world and all of that input, not to mention the many different kinds of conversations that are constantly influencing. That generativity can never be recreated in some respect. And I think the senses are deeply connected to that. Anyway, my 2 cents. Other questions?
Curious about ways to meaningfully improve or enhance our protocols for psychedelic research, which include very sutric or mindfulness-focused approaches. What other contemplative forms could expand sense awareness, consciousness, and integrate into our daily lived experiences?
Psychedelic-assisted Tara Deity yoga. If anybody wants to talk about that as a project, come find me. I'll let the others weigh in here.
Yes, I have to think about that too.
Let me make one more point there, though. This is something I've thought a lot about, which is the psychedelic psychotherapy aesthetic is people in blindfolds wearing earphones, laying down with a therapist. I was at a talk in Santa Monica recently, and one of the people from USONA Institute, which is a nonprofit based in Madison that makes most of the drugs that are used in psychedelic clinical studies in the US was there. And she gave a talk highlighting Usona's vision for the future. And she showed a picture, these are great people, but she showed this picture of a therapist standing up looking so pleased with herself with like 8 people all lying down with earphones and blindfolds in a room. And I was like, that's the vision for the future of therapy? Like, I count me out of that vision, right? Like, I don't want to do that. And I was talking with Wolf about this at the break, like, a whole aesthetic domain available to us that's relevant in the talk about sense making. Like, we are sensorial creatures, and the dark has an important role for sure. But also, if we were sort of took an empirical approach to aesthetic and aesthetic development, I think we could probably do better than people laying in hospital treatment rooms with blindfolds on their eyes. That would be, we could engage empirically, which could also be really good art. And I think I'm so glad for that question, because I mean, one thing I would say is like let's definitely think about aesthetic protocols beyond people with blindfolds and like their iPhone playlist playing in their headphones, right? And it's an open question, and I hope certainly the informal experiments that I've done with groups of people with this sort of eyes open data yoga practice in places where it's legal, by the way, all the jurisdictions where I've done this are legal. That's an important point to make. Have been very profoundly impactful for people, and that's made me ask the broader question of, well, what else can be impactful? And that's why James's talk is so fascinating, because you're highlighting the fact that this aesthetic domain, beyond simply having your eyes closed, there's a whole rich territory for sort of artistic creation and sort of scientific investigation, there. So yeah, thanks for that question.
One thought came to mind in relation to what you were saying, David, is that in terms of practices, the early Nyingti tradition, or early Dzogchen tradition, is very, very rich in different kinds of practices that aren't necessarily they're probably practiced now to some extent, and Devin knows very well about these things. But one of the things that came to mind as what might be the exact antithesis of this model of closing your eyes and sort of listening, kind of tuning into some music and so forth, would be the practice of what they call Korde Rushen, which is like differentiating samsara and nirvana, where you essentially go out into an empty valley and take off all your clothes and run around, and the goal is to sort of purify the seeds for being reborn into the different classes of beings, and you act like them. So you act like the different classes of beings, and kind of, as much as you can possibly empathize and understand with the way that they walk, the way that the sounds they make, the thoughts they might have. So in body, speech, and mind, and you do this for days. And it's, certain teachers teach this practice, and, that this is still done. So anyway, that's just a completely other contemplative modality. And we have so many others too besides.
But Sarah, I think your point before about have the blindfold and having earphones in, but actually I had an experience here back in April, May, when they opened this. But I think Michael might be able to. Was it the Golden Hour that played upstairs? And that was an amazing thing. I don't know how many people experienced them. And basically, you have a blindfold on, you sit down, and there's 4 musicians. They walk around you, sing these beautiful harmonies. And sometimes be 1 person, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. But they'll walk around you, go up step ladders, and you've got no idea where the sound's kind of coming from. Because usually when you experience sound, it's usually like stereo, and it's just kind of there. But when you've actually got the musicians walking around you, whispering into your ear, standing over there, it really focuses your mind, and it takes you somewhere else. So I think by using and really restricting your senses, can make it really kind of powerful, and that was a good example. Yeah, but typically I think that sort of thing of headphones on, and that's it's just maybe a little bit vanilla.
Can I just ask, just to this point, how important do you guys believe the guide is in the context of psychedelic contemplative protocols, the guide or a lineage or a tradition framing the experience?
Wolf, that one's for you.
I think it really depends. I think it really depends on the situation. I mean, at a very practical level, it's important. It can be important to. It's important to be in a situation that probably, you know, is mindful of the fact that your sensors are a little bit maybe not able to respond to danger, for example, in the same way that they normally would. So like on a practical level, that's like level, I would say that's like the base level for a guide, right? So I'm speaking with Peru, so Christina, I mean, there's just that, like, you're in the jungle and there's big centipedes and snakes and like animals and like, you know, things you can trip over. And so it's just good to have someone like be able to take care of you. And you get past that though, where like you're okay, you're self-sufficient. Obviously when I was doing this long form Ritmo experiment, she wasn't able to be with me the whole time, so I was mostly by myself. But I kind of had to, like, she had to kind of see that I could be by myself. But then on the level 2, I think in terms of a guide, it depends what you're looking for. So, you know, and in the case of what I was doing, I was making art. I was using the Ritmo as an art making device, and my guide was Tada. Like, that was my guide, and Tada was a reflection of myself. But it can be really helpful to have an external reflection of yourself, because sometimes it's very difficult to believe yourself. It's sometimes easier to believe yourself when yourself is reflected onto something first, right? You listen more closely when it comes from over there instead of from in here sometimes. And so I think the extent to which a person needs guidance really depends on that person, their physical capabilities, what they're looking for, what their background is, their sensitivity. I think it's, it has to respect those things. So I wouldn't want to offer a flat recommendation, but I do think there's something very simple about just like basic safety.
I also think as well, you know, collectively, I mean, this was 30, 40 years ago. Like in England, you know, the whole rise of kind of acid house and that whole rave kind of culture. People would take psychedelics, MDMA, and collectively, people looked after each other, you know, and there was a sense of you're all from all sorts of different backgrounds, and on the whole, people cared and actually brought out really good things in people. And there was never one person kind of, you know, coordinating or curating it. So I think it can go and it can bring out, you know, the deep goodness in people. I think, you know, we don't always need a leader.
No, I think you said it all. Yeah, I think there's just no one size fits all kind of that we can direct toward this. But yeah, I mean, that being said, just the larger notion of setting a motive or something can be an interesting way of going about it, and a safe venue, safety, and sort of this basic idea of set and setting is kind of being very helpful, and then being really clear on what you want from the experience. And
yeah, maybe related to this question or some of the themes that are emerging around kind of the aesthetic quality of eyes open types of meditation, and this mention of Koderushin, the question about the teacher. And this may be sort of my hobby horse, but I'm interested in the themes of relationality that are emerging as we talk about senses. I mean, even in the Buddhist context, James, I think, mentioned that like regimes of sensing and begin with the object of sensing, right? The object that is being sensed is actually like sort of included as in the phenomenological process of perception. Are there other thoughts or elaborations on relationality, the senses, contemplation, and technology?
I was going to ask you a question, actually, Gentry. You know, with your studies in Buddhism and especially your work with studying sort of Tibetan Buddhism, like in the West, occasionally we have like votives, we have things which we become sort of sacred, and they have and then become an inherent spirituality. With Tibetan Buddhism, is it a symbol or is it actually embodied, the actual vessel?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question that is, I've thought a lot about that in relation to especially Buddhist Tantra in particular. So Tibetan, these kind of deity yoga and these kind of forms of meditation. I have, there's language of signification, but a central goal of these practices is to collapse duality. So there's also a language of presence. And much of what the practices are aimed at is collapsing that semiotic or disrupting that semiotic operation of signifying something extrinsic. So there's really rich theorization in the Buddhist Tantric commentarial tradition on precisely that I think, the only semiotic theorist we can approach that is similarly rich is Peirce, but even that's kind of pale, in my view, by comparison. So we have both of those operations and more going on.
Other thoughts? Is there something we're missing when it comes to relationships, contemplation, and technology?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about in terms of relationality, sensing is a relationship with your environment. And in terms of transformative experiences, one thing I was thinking was about how this sort of ongoing relationship with the environment is what's going to be the transformative experience for you. Matthew Radcliffe has this notion of sinking in, that some facts. When you have an emotion about something that's very localized, isn't very deep, doesn't affect a lot of your life, the emotional reality of that is manifest to you pretty much right away. Like if you want if you're afraid of the bear in the woods or something, it's the very sort of cliche example. That thing is that emotional reality sort of impresses on you right away. But in a transformative experience, that's not really what's happening, because the thing that's affecting your life is affecting it in such a deep way that there's absolutely no way for you to absorb that instantly. So people end up in a state of shock and alienation, and things feel just incredibly surreal. And why do they feel surreal? Because all of the habits that we have sort of presume a different reality than you're actually in. So the relational component is coming to terms with that reality in all of the different situations in your life, and that's what would end up changing your sort of experience and your expectations and so.
I've heard kind of a grisly anecdote to that, which is that when people sometimes, like if people encounter a dead body, they presume that it's a mannequin. If there isn't like a context for them to perceive it as a dead body, if they like encounter it in the woods or something, they think like, oh, there's a puppet, or there's a, like this, I think this speaks to this inability to actually perceive the reality, yeah.
You're applying the sort of most ready concept you have to hand, and that's...
Yeah. Other questions?
Yes, I think we have time for maybe one more.
Yeah.
So we've been talking a lot about recognizing the limits of how humans sense and how our perception of the world is shaped by our senses. Sometimes it makes it sound like there is no reality out there independent of our senses. But aren't our senses also a way of contacting a reality that exceeds us? How do we share a world, a real world, if we all sense it differently? Is there a world we all share despite our sensory limits?
Heavy hitter.
Pass it along.
Pass along perceptual realism. Let's assume there's a real world. We all pick out different facets of it given our sensory capacities. And I mean, we're all in a shared sensory reality. We all have a huge overlap in our sensory capabilities. And that's why we have a shared ontology in part, right? And I mean, we could think of this as just purely a selection point. It's not that the thing isn't out there, it's that how that thing shows up to you depends on your sensory capabilities. And yeah, like I take this person's point, there's a translational issue. Yeah, I'm not sure how to address that part. But there's a translation, yeah, here.
Is Michael here? I don't know if he's here. But there's this, Bob Dylan line, I'll let you be in my dream if I can be in yours. And so I think using the analogy of dreaming here is quite interesting, right? So if instead of worrying about like a collective dream, I take this person's point, right? It can really sound like, well, everything's internally constructed, there's nothing real. But like the example of dreaming is interesting. So say you're having a dream, which we all agree is mostly yours. Like it's very hard for me to enter into your dream in any kind of way. But let's say that somebody could have the same dream as you. Well, now what is that? You can have a conversation about it and you both observe similar-ish things. Well, that sounds like the emergence of some sort of shared foundational something. And then now imagine 3 people have that dream and 4 people. Well, here we are, 8 billion people hallucinating a particular kind of, sort of post-capitalist industrial dream. Maybe, I think when you think about it on the individual level, it can sort of degenerate very, very quickly into sort of a form of, you think everything is within you and constructed, and then that's a problem. But to use the analogy of dreaming, I think is quite interesting to consider. Is like, well, what happens when a whole bunch of people collectively dream the same dream? What's the phenomenology of that? And so I don't have answers to that. But I have wondered, so one of the models of cognition that's really popular at the moment is something called predictive coding. And it's this idea that you're effectively constructing, you're constructing a map of the world around you, and you kind of are only seeing what's in the model of that map. So you're projecting this model of the world, and then you only ever see the errors in that model, and then you iteratively update your model to align with that. And if everyone around you has a certain kind of model, then your model is going to adapt to fit that model. So to go back to the dreaming metaphor, it's like you're kind of, by being born into this particular sociocultural instantiation, you are kind of naturally going to drop into the same dream as the other 8 billion people around you. And then if you take that even a step further, well, what happens if we all are hallucinating the same, dreaming the same dream? Then it becomes very interesting to wonder, like, how do we collectively shape the reality field around us en masse? Like, maybe we perceive things in a certain way, non-magically without spirits because, like, everyone else is doing that dream. Again, these are very provocative, open-ended questions to end with, and I'll lose my license as a physicist if I talk too much about them. But yeah, I think that's a great question.
Thoughts? No? Far out. Well, I think that's it for us today. Thank you again to our presenters for their fantastic presentations.